Un cimitir. Nimeni nu se mai ferește să spună că asta a ajuns Marea Mediterană. Peste 1700 de imigranți și-au pierdut viața în primele 4 luni ale anului încercând să scape de război, de sărăcie și de persecuții. Un număr record care a expus vulnerabilitatea comunității internaționale la o tragedie fără precedent în ultimele decenii. La fiecare 10 morți, 8 și-au pierdut viața în Mediterană și tot atâți vin din Africa. Iar pentru cei care supraviețuiesc, nu avem destui bani, destul loc, destulă voință politică sau socială pentru a le oferi ceea ce și-au dorit când au urcat în acele bărci, adică o viață mai bună. Dar Mediterana nu este singurul loc al unor tragedii fără pereche în istoria recentă, este doar cel mai apropiat de noi și poate de aceea ne șochează cel mai mult. Kenya și Al-Shabaab, Nigeria și Boko Haram, Irak și statul islamic. Cum arată situația cu adevărat în aceste locuri? Există vreo speranță de pace? Gândul a avut ocazia să intervieveze unul dintre cei mai mari mediatori mondiali din zone de conflict. Este vorba despre Prabha Sankaranarayan, președinta organizației Mediatori Fără Frontiere, care a venit la București pentru un congres internațional de pace.
What are human stories, the real stories behind these headlines that we have become immune to are?
Well, let me start by saying one of the things that we can all do is probably focus as much on the work that is going on behind the scenes, as you're asking, as on what captures the headlines. So one question I would have for the media is, why do we keep showing these images? This is exactly what they want. That's the attention they want. So the more we show these images, we're giving them the publicity that they want. So the stories behind those are probably not as soundbite friendly because they're stories of people who are doing work that doesn't capture the headlines. My hope is that we bring them to light. Pastor James and Imam Shafa, they are two people who are here. So the story there, if people choose to pay attention to them, the pastor and the imam, is one of two people who fought. That is their story. They were on opposing sides, a Christian and a Muslim. What they have been doing for the last 15 years, 20 years now, is telling their story to say it is possible. And they have been working with the people impacted by Boko Haram at exactly the kind of countering that people need to see more and more and more of. How often do you see the pastor and the imam in the headlines? But you see Boko Haram all the time.
I do. I write some of the headlines.
So I would ask those of you writing the headlines, those of you watching the headlines to say, what are the rest of the stories? What are the other stories behind those headlines? And why is this all we see? And there is a damage in the visual imagery because we become immune to it. So what are we doing to ourselves? I have a wonderful friend, Millicent Otiano, who's also here today, who works with the media to say, how can you tell the stories in a way that not just inflames the conflict or gives more power to the instigators, but tells the story of those and tells the story in a way that actually takes away from the power of the violent.
I'm happy you brought the issue of the media coverage. And
thank you, though. I have to thank you for giving me an opportunity, even as I say, please do more than the headlines.
Well, let's talk about this. Both Amnesty International and UNICEF say that, estimate that Boko Haram is responsible for the kidnapping of over 2,000 girls and women, and that in Nigeria alone, close to 800,000 children have been displaced by this group. And we all remember that when the first 200 girls, the girls from Chibok, were kidnapped, there was this huge worldwide outcry. There was this hashtag with Bring Back Our Girls, and everyone had it. And you would see Michelle Obama on Twitter with it, and you would see pop stars and celebrities and regular people having this poster. And then as it often happened, there was silence, and another 1,800 women were kidnapped, and no one talks about it anymore. And the girls have not been brought back, and the children are still displaced, and there was no hashtag for the rest of them. So what is your reaction to this cycle of immediate reaction and outcry and then lack of action?
Well, what is also interesting is what gets attention and what doesn't. So some of my friends and colleagues who work in that area said, help me understand. This many people died in France. 40 countries showed their solidarity. This many people died in Nigeria. Within a month, there was nothing. I can only point out to that difference and say we need to pay attention to that difference. Because when people don't feel like they have a voice, when people try to speak to what their needs are and it is not heard, those are the conditions that create the conflict and the violence we see later on. So there are lots of reasons we could talk about why we spent this much time and attention on France, which comes back to your question of if it's far away and doesn't seemingly affect us, is it easier to ignore it? And does the face of pain in Nigeria or in South Thailand or in Ecuador or in Timor look different from the face of pain in France, in Paris and Brussels, and in Belfast? It must, because the media doesn't respond to it in the same way, and people think that, and people watch that, and the images that, and the stories that are conveyed communicate to the people who live in those countries whose voices and stories are not reported that they are maybe less important. That maybe that their pain is not as deep. So I would ask that we hold that mirror up and say, what are we communicating by paying attention to some issues and not to others? And I will leave that with an open question, because if that's all I paid attention to, I would get hopeless. And I'm not, because there are people like the 200 people who are gathering here, who are working in each of these communities, who are building connections, who are building relationships in communities, and addressing the legacy of deeply divided pasts. They stay committed in these communities for 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And that's where you see the difference.
Since we have this debate here, and we've talked about it when Charlie Hebdo and Barambaga happened, and we've talked about it when Garissa and the crash of the Germanwings flight happened. So since we are noticing this difference, I want to know what people in these parts of the world, in these countries, are saying about this, about the fact that it does happen that 17 dead people in Paris outweigh 2,000 in Nigeria in attention, in coverage, in outcry, in everything. What do they say about it? Do they feel abandoned? Do they feel offended? Do they feel, what do they feel?
All of those things. All of those things. That somehow their lives don't matter as much. That what they are experiencing doesn't have the same impact. And yet I would say that's not the only response, Alina. The good news is that there are hundreds of people working in these communities. And there is sometimes almost a schizophrenic response. On the one hand, there is a response of violence. On the other, there is the aid that is coming into these communities. I have friends who've been working with the victims of all of these conflicts that you're talking about, all of these tragedies that you're talking about. They're working with the families of the individuals who are deeply impacted by these events. And so what we also have is an extraordinarily, in many ways, extraordinarily generous response. It's not enough. It is not enough. There's no question about that. It is not enough that we pay attention for such a short period of time. But what is also not enough, I will say, what is the first thing we respond with when there are acts of violence in each of these recent episodes? It is a security response. So let's increase security. Let's make ourselves feel safe. And while I think safety is important, if we continue to focus only on security in Paris, in Brussels, in these countries, in these communities, if our response is only a security response, all we would do is build the walls between communities. A security response is not a safety. If we keep saying we have to build more walls, we have to have more police, that's only a security response. That is not enough. What we need to do at the community level, which is what we did in Greece. 2 years ago, a group of mediators started working with the immigrant and refugee populations, the representatives of these communities in Greece, with the idea that if we don't build the capacity in communities to have dialogue across divides, that the violence can escalate, that the isolation, that the separation can deepen. When that separation deepens is when you see increase in violence. So that group started by training a small group of mediators in holding dialogues in the community. They brought everyone together. Now what we have there is an organization called Metaplasis that holds dialogues across different communities. Now that to me is very different from a security response. And what we are looking at is partnerships with organizations in France, with partnership with organizations in Brussels, partnerships with organizations in UK to build that community response. I think you need the safety, but if that's all we did, we have done what we did in Libya. Stopped before we addressed the root causes. And that takes time. And we need to make a commitment to spend that kind of time. France's population has been changing. Lebanon's population has changed dramatically with the Syrian influx, right? It's changed dramatically. So we need to put our efforts into how that shifting identity can build communities of tolerance, build the pluralism, not the tribalism that separates people.